Okay, welcome everyone. We're pleased to have you here at our first Formations and Reformations in Catholic Thought lunch hour lecture. I'm Dr. Meredith Bacola, and I'm serving as acting director of the Jesuit Center for this year. And along with my colleagues, Dr. Penner, who's speaking today, Dr. Michael Caligieri, and Dr. Daniel McLeod, who's off campus, we are the largest Catholic Studies program in Canada. Which is really exciting, and it enables us to do really great initiatives like this lunch hour series that really addresses issues related to both the Catholic and Jesuit identity of St. Paul's College, as well as connections to fields such as theology, philosophy, the liberal arts, and film today. So very excited about that. As part of the college community and a member of the University of Manitoba campuses, we'd like to begin by reminding our audience that we are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Aninawak, Asininawak, Dakota Aote, Dene, Inuit, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis. We reflect together on the harms and mistakes of the past and look forward to working in greater partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and better collaboration. Now, today's speaker spent 2 weeks with me last year traveling around Ireland, so I'm really happy he's still good to be in the same room with me. So he's a valued member of our college community here at St. Paul's, and he also teaches as well and is a valued member of the Department of English, Film, Theatre, and Media. He earned his doctorate here from the University of Manitoba in 2020 and has really been working in his own research on considering the use of media in constructions of popular persona like Robert Redford, who very recently passed away. And he spent a lot of time as well looking at intersections between films and Catholicism, which kind of relates to our talk today. Recently, he spoke at the Fitzgerald Conference in New York City, and earlier this year, I had the pleasure of speaking alongside him at the Prairie Symposium for the Common Good in Regina. Today he will be speaking on how kindly he hears my confession, Hitchcock's I Confess, and the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And if you wouldn't mind keeping questions or comments until the end, we'll give a bit of time, and we'll also allow you time if you need to make it to your 1 o'clock classes. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Penner.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pacola, for that gracious introduction. And yes, we are still friends after Ireland. It was no hard feelings there. It was a great time. And thank you, of course, to the department for giving me this chance to share some of my research with you. I put this QR code here. This is based on a longer article that was published in International Studies in Catholic Education. So if you just can't get enough of everything I have to say by the end of it, you can go there and read it. And I'll put that back up at the end. All right, so you may be unfamiliar with both I Confess and the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, but I hope by the end of this, you'll have at least some familiarity with both and understand how they work together. All right, so take a late-night murder, a desperate confession, the romantic entanglements of a priest, a police chase through the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, the impossibly perfect jawline of Montgomery Clift, one of the great noses in history, cinema history, smack dab in the middle of Carl Malden's face, and mix it all together under the steady hand of one of the 20th century's cinematic masters, and you wind up with Alfred Hitchcock's 1953 thriller, I Confess. It is Hitchcock's only film set exclusively in Canada, and his most overtly Catholic. It is also one of the few popular films that hinges almost entirely on an element of dogmatic law. Not the only one, but one of the few, which is actually much more exciting than it sounds, I promise. So I regularly screen this film in my course Catholicism on Film, which I teach here at St. Paul's College. And what I'm going to talk about today is a thought experiment that I assign that requires students to place themselves in the role of the film's main character, Father Logan, played by Montgomery Clift. And the assignment, which requires students to consider what they would do in Logan's place, works to engage students not only with the film, but it is also particularly useful example of the 5 elements of the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm in practice, because the students need to use it to wade through the sort of moral and ethical and spiritual and religious ambiguities this theoretical predicament puts them in. So while a full synopsis of the film would of course be useful, it would also take a very long time. So I'm just going to hit the highlights here of what you need to know to understand what I'm going to say. So I Confess begins with a late night murder in Quebec City, in the old city, and a man wearing a cassock, a priestly garment, fleeing the scene. The man is Otto Keller, and he goes directly from there to confess his crime to his priest, Father Logan. In a perfectly Hitchcockian twist, a bunch of circumstantial evidence points toward Logan as the prime suspect in the murder, especially after Otto hides the bloody cassock in Logan's room. And so Logan is arrested and tried for murder, but because of the seal of confession prevents him from clearing his own name by telling the police what he knows, right? He heard this confession, can't break confession, so now he's arrested. Spoiler alert, things work out for Logan in the end, but only after about an hour and a half spent in this moral quagmire wherein Hitchcock layers a thick Christ complex onto his protagonist. So that's what we're dealing with. For the sake of context for this assignment and how that works, let me explain a little bit about Catholicism on film, the course. So it is not a course geared towards spiritual formation or any sort of a religious edification or proselytizing in any way. Rather, it is this critical study, a critical survey of the intersection between commercial cinema and the Catholic Church, facilitated through the study of a dozen or so popular films. So here's all the films. I've taught the course twice now, and here's all the films that I've used. And the films come from several eras, movements, and nations, and each deal with Catholicism directly and thoughtfully. So using the tenets of film studies and Catholic theological discourses, we consider what these 2 cultural giants of the 20th century can teach us and teach about each other. Commercial cinema, I feel, provides an excellent avenue for understanding the tenets and theology of Catholicism because of its insistence on a connection to human emotion and its ability to generate empathy. So when selecting films for the syllabus, which you see here, I avoid films that simplistically celebrate or denigrate Catholicism. Rather, I opt for works that address the challenges and benefits of living within or around a faith system personally and communally. These films tend to present characters that move between the church, which has its ideals, and principles, and promises of answers, but is always a little boring, and the world, which can be meaningless, vague, and troubling, but also a lot more fun. So throughout the course, we consider this sort of messy liminal space, and in doing so, we challenge any sort of simplistic understanding of the Catholic belief system or a simplistic rejection of it, by demanding the consideration of these multiple perspectives throughout. At the forefront of these discussions is a drive towards empathy, something popular cinema, as I said, is particularly strong at eliciting. I Confess stands out even from other films I screen in the course as uniquely able to push students into a consideration of this messiness found at the junction of secular and religious life. This thought experiment that I'm going to talk about works well on this emotional and intellectual level precisely because Hitchcock was operating in a similar vein. So French critic, theorist, and new wave filmmaker Francois Truffaut, in a conversation with Hitchcock, implied that Hitchcock's primary target was this sort of emotional connection with his audience, which often meant that he measured his success or failure in ticket sales in terms of whether he thought a movie worked or not. This entertainment-forward focus is one of the reasons that Hitchcock's films were so popular and remain engaging and effective. However, his priority on entertainment does not preclude I Confess or any of his other films from being useful works for serious consideration. So an aspect of Hitchcock's persona that's not often discussed when we talk about him, but I think is important to our thinking about him in connection with this film, is his faith. So while he remains one of the most famous alumni of St. Ignatius College in Enfield and was raised in a Roman Catholic family in his neighborhood in Essex that boasted an above average percentage of Catholic residents, as an adult, Hitchcock was somewhat cagey about his faith. And there's debates from different biographers about all of that. He discussed it briefly in interviews with Truffaut as well as with Peter Bogdanovich, but mostly he doubted that his religious upbringing, as he called it, had much of an effect on his work. Outside of the film that we're talking about, there are rarely any Catholics or mentions of Catholicism. You can pick out a few examples, but pretty much not there. However, some scholars, like biographers Donald Spoto, Raymond Durgnat, and Richard Blake, have extensively considered the religious angle of his work, with Blake describing Hitchcock's Catholicism as an afterimage that left an indelible mark on his films. His book is very interesting, but I'm not going to go too deep in that. Just to say that nowhere is that mark more clearly identifiable than in I Confess. Oh, and there's Hitch in all his movies there. So this is the assignment that I give to the students, the I Confess thought experiment. So I'm just going to read this through so you get a feel for what it is. So for this assignment, I would like you to put yourself in Logan's place and tell me what you think you would do, right? You've heard the confession, you're up for murder. Take me through your thought process. Would you be worried about judgment from God for breaking a vow? Would you be concerned about losing your position as a priest or being demoted? Take God out and the church out of the equation. On a purely secular humanist level, is it important to always keep promises? Even if it will benefit you to the point of saving your life to divulge something that someone asked you to keep secret. Does Keller's antagonism and sadistic behavior towards Logan negate Logan's obligation? Would you consider a person's behavior in deciding whether to keep a promise? And when I give them this assignment, I say, you don't have to answer each of these questions in turn, which is always the undergrad first choice, right, is to just give me a bunch of answers. But I encourage them to take these and start thinking and work through the process and show me how it works and how they come to a conclusion. And ultimately, they have to give me an answer, what they would do. So I've chosen to model my approach to both this assignment and the course more generally on the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, which I'm just going to start calling the IPP because that's a mouthful. Not only because of St. Paul's College's long history and deep connection to the Jesuit tradition, but also because of its emphasis on understanding the world through empathy and experience. Jesuit education, which William C. McGinnis calls, quote, a living tradition based on a specific heritage that is being continually shaped by current decisions, works well to emphasize the empathetic reasoning at the heart of this assignment, which expands beyond the realm of religion and can therefore be useful to religious and non-religious students alike, because pedagogy inspired by St. Ignatius is profoundly human and consequently universal, which we are told by the Secretariat for Education, the Jesuits. So it is this long-standing tradition of engaging with and learning from and augmenting material that is not intended for religious practice that makes the IPP ideal for this course and assignment. As Elizabeth Murray Morelli writes, the Jesuit ideal of critical engagement with the secular culture reflected the basic premise of the Renaissance humanist tradition, and religious and moral inspiration could be found religious and moral inspiration could be found in secular subjects. Hence, coming to understand more about Catholicism or any spirituality via an art form as fixated on worldly success as Hollywood movies, in this case, is quite in line, I think, with the learning from secular sources, which makes it ideal for me. On the other hand, the introspective nature of the assignment means that for students to do well, they must consciously or not work their way through these 5 elements of the IPP, and I know you're wondering, what 5 elements? I'll get to them, don't worry. So even though, of course, I do not require that the students directly consider the 5 elements in their responses, the central dilemma that they're being put through and the requirement for them to declare an action means that students inevitably do what Susan Mountain and Rebecca Nowacek say is the goal of IPP, which is learning to pay attention, developing the ability to reflect on one's experience, and then acting and evaluating or questioning one's presumptions. So these activities, according to Mountain and Nowacek, are key learning events appropriate to any educational endeavor, religious or secular, committed to a student's intellectual and moral development. So here are the 5 elements of the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And so we're going to move through these 5 elements, context, experience, reflection, action, and evaluation, one by one, to show how this thought experiment fulfills the stated goals of the IPP by expanding in the stated goals of expanding a student's experience beyond merely learning a skill or gaining knowledge. Rather, the assignment provides an avenue for personal growth by rewarding the contemplation of ethical questions around commitments, responsibilities, freedoms, and justice, both personal and communal. So here we go. Context. Normally, if I was in a classroom, this is where I would go, any questions? But we're not doing that. You have to wait till the end. So in traditional notions of the IPP, the context in question typically belongs to the student, right? And the vital aspect is the teacher's ability to account for that context. As this assignment is less focused on the sort of teacher-student relationship, the context here and in my lectures is Logan's. So to understand Logan's situation, one must have some familiarity with things like Quebec history, the uniqueness of the Francophone and Catholic culture within Quebec City and its surrounding areas, and the history of the Hollywood's production code, which had a significant bearing on the shape of the narrative and the portrayal of the characters. We're not going to get too far into that one. Again, if you're really interested in that, read the longer paper. So in my lectures, I discuss these backgrounds where I also spend a considerable amount of time examining how Hitchcock creates a characterization of Quebec City out of the key elements and its significant landmarks. So Quebec City is amongst the oldest European settlements in North America, and it dedicates a considerable energies and money to the preservation of buildings, streetscapes, and even military fortifications of that colonial era. A great deal of effort and expense is put into preserving the wall that surrounds the old city. So you can it's not the red thing, but the kind of gray and black wall where it shoots off from the citadel there. It goes all the way around the old city. And to the 3 gates, the St. Louis, the Kent, and the St. Jean, which I've circled there, that they preserve these things, even though modern visitors, of course, can pass freely in and out of the city. So in his film, Hitchcock regularly employs the imposing nature of these mostly symbolic fortifications as a vital part of the film's visual language, especially as the narrative tension increases and the city becomes a claustrophobic space for Logan. But it's not only walls and small openings that Hitchcock fixates on. Catholic religious symbols are everywhere throughout the film. Here we can see this, not only in expected places like churches or rectories or private homes, but in courtrooms, government buildings, and public squares. So for instance, this is Father Logan on trial, and this is what's next to him in the courtroom. These images serve as constant reminders to the audience of the enormous weight Catholicism, both a cultural entity and for Logan a symbol of vocational and spiritual expectation, has on the community and Logan's actions throughout the narrative. So all of that to say about Quebec, Hitchcock's characterization of Quebec is not exactly flattering, although the city itself is quite beautifully rendered, and if you've been there, it's fun to sort of see the places. So as it presents, but it's not only flattering because it presents a community that is driven by gossip, filled with parishioners who are either overly conservative or dangerously duplicitous, and it is so crowded with this religious iconography that it becomes egregiously repressive, even to Logan, who is of course a religious symbol himself. So in this way, the Quebec City of the film becomes the canvas onto which Hitchcock paints this alternate version of the city. And this becomes obvious when we realize that Hitchcock frequently imports locations from other parts of Quebec into the old city, thus creating a sort of simulacrum that better fits his thematic ends. And this occurs with several churches used in the film, especially the interiors, which are often located outside the city. But the best example can be found during Logan's long walk to turn himself in to the police. He finally, he knows he's going to be arrested, and so he goes. But before he does, he walks through the city. And we get this image here. So Hitchcock includes an evocative shot of a statue of Jesus carrying the cross in the extreme foreground, while Logan passes far in the distance there. You can see him back there, moving through the space. He's up on the other sidewalk. So the symbolic significance of this shot is, of course, unmistakable. Logan is Christ bearing the sins of another on himself, just like Christ carrying the cross. But for this moment to have happened in the real world, Logan would have had to travel some 30 kilometers to the town of Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré, which would, of course, be an extreme detour, even for a man about to face such injustice. But Hitchcock incorporates this in. He creates this simulacrum because being confined to reality would restrict his ability to employ the surroundings as an expression of Logan's dire psychological state, which is exactly what he's trying to do. So this suffocatingly overwhelming presence of Catholic symbols in every shot are key to expressing that Logan's strict adherence to the tenets of his faith are the very thing pushing him towards a possible wrongful conviction and likely execution, because we still had the death penalty at that time. So all of this speaks to the heightened state of community expectations placed on Logan. The imagery in the film impresses upon the viewer just how dire it would be for Logan to break his vow. Yes, keeping his vow could result in the execution for a crime he did not commit, but breaking his vow would mean, of course, the loss of his job and disconnection from his community, which, as Hitchcock makes clear, is his entire world. A priest losing his job is unlike most professional setbacks. When a priest is fired, there is a significant level of shame surrounding it, which is added to by a lack of transferable skills, and of course the monopoly on employing priests, which is held by the Catholic Church. So this means that Logan is unlikely to find another job that he finds meaningful. Being a priest is also more than a job. It's a vocation, a lifestyle, and a calling. So losing that role represents an existential crisis for Logan. So understanding Logan's social, religious, geographical, and even allegorical political context, which other writers have looked into, and the ways that Hitchcock crafts their on-screen depictions is vital to the students as they form their arguments. As the IPP states that it is, it's as vital to students as the IPP states it is to teachers understanding their pupils. This becomes even more important since the nature of the assignment is to consider the problem from a contemporaneous rather than contemporary position, meaning that understanding Quebec City in the 1950s through the lens of Hitchcock's directorial perspective is vital to forming the empathy necessary to consider the questions. All right, so context, we move on to experience. So we know that, quote, experience for Ignatius meant to taste something internally, and that learning should go beyond a purely intellectual grasp. Rather, Ignatius urges that the whole person, mind, heart, and will should enter the learning experience. This idea of tasting something internally goes back to the idea of empathy and cinema's unique ability to engender empathy for characters. Part of that process comes from context, but it is even more helpful for students to bring their own experiences to Logan's situation. This is why the assignment encourages them to consider themselves not merely as him, but themselves transported to that time, place, and position. This is often the most dynamic section of the assignment because students must wrestle with the cognitive dissonance that this question creates. I found that students tend to think about confession in this assignment either religiously or intellectually. For students in the latter category, the morality of the situation tends to shift towards something like secular humanism, leaving students to consider whether the immorality of obstructing justice outweighs the immorality of breaking a vow. This sometimes leads to questions of which vow is more important, the vow to keep the secrecy of confession or the vow to tell the truth that Logan takes on the witness stand. The other experience that becomes important is students' personal beliefs about, say, the existence of the afterlife. For students that firmly believe in eternal life, the issue of Logan or them keeping their vows takes on this added significance. Yes, breaking his vow would save Logan's life on earth, but since, for some respondents, this is only a short part of an everlasting existence, there needs to be a consideration of eternal ramifications. In these cases, Logan's silence and possible death is nearly justified, as it will lead to an eternal reward for his faithfulness. For students without this eternal focus, the moral implications of obstructing justice are far more important. Some students brought in philosophical notions like consequentialism to argue that even though it would be wrong within the tenets of canonical law for Logan to turn in Keller, the restoration of order and justice it would lead to should be considered more important than the breaking of a rule. This argument posits that Logan's silence prevents justice from being achieved and leaves a clearly remorseless murderer free. Therefore, Logan's dedication to his vows is immoral because it makes the community a more dangerous place. Which is exactly what happens near the end of the film when, again, spoiler alert, Keller shoots a bunch of people as he tries to escape. So we could also put those on Logan, possibly. And some students have done that. They've said, Logan's actually a monster. But anyway, I won't name any names on that one. So, but the focus on students' place on this sort of terrestrial justice speaks to the idea of social responsibility, which is a big part of Jesuit education. Father Pedro Arrupe stressed that the promotion of justice was a constitutive element of the Jesuit mission, because for Jesus, the genuine love of God is always linked to love of neighbor, and from this stems just relationships. Therefore, it follows that our students would train as men and women for others. So this situation gets even more complicated when we consider who the other is in Logan's situation. If Keller is the other, then Logan is acting selflessly to protect him. However, if the man Keller murdered is the other, then Logan's action is preventing justice. If we consider the larger community as the other, then Logan's concealment is clearly detrimental to their safety. And so he is not making things better. In every case, students' levels of experience, whether with religion, the act of confession, or witnessing of justice or injustice, or exposure to philosophical concepts beyond Catholicism, all of them are important factors in how they work out the choice that they would make in this situation. Reflection. So while it may be possible to watch I Confess without deeply considering how one might act in a similar situation, I've never been able to watch it without deep reflection, but that's why I do what I do. The nature of the assignment requires a more deliberate participation. So by placing themselves in the role of the priest in 1950s Quebec City and considering all the social, political, and religious implications, the students tend to make value judgments with regard to Logan's actions. However, the more important part of the assignment comes as students separate themselves from Logan and reflect on what their own actions might be. At this point, to put it in Korth's terms, the students deepen their understanding of the implications for oneself and others, and achieve personal insights into events, ideas, truths, and the distortion of truth. In many ways, the reflections take on the traits one might expect to see in questions of, say, martyrdom. The students debate over the loss of vocation versus the loss of life, temporal shame versus eternal damnation, loyalty to others versus self-preservation, the expectations of God, whether a representation of community or a literal figure, versus the rules of the church, and whether Logan's actions represent folly or heroism. This, of course, leads to a great deal of equivocating en route to a definitive answer. And although I require them to give me an answer for this assignment, the actual answer is not nearly as important as the time spent in reflection. So in fact, I only require the answer because I want students' minds working on this both abstract and concrete level as they consider the problem as though it was actually pressing on them. So, like any crisis, the question here forces the consideration of two opposing situations, neither of which is ideal. And so the cognitive dissonance that students must navigate puts them in Logan's place and hence fosters compassion for his plight. Jesuit education, states the Secretariat for Education, promotes experiences that encourage students to put themselves in their fellows' shoes because compassion is a prerequisite for positive action. You'll notice I'm getting shorter and shorter with each of these. We're on to action now. So while I hope, of course, that the students will never be faced with a situation like the one Hitchcock has contrived here, although I'd love to hear about it if they did, it is likely that at some point they will, of course, face moral, ethical, religious, social, or political challenge that will require them to wade into the sort of cognitive ambivalence a thought experiment like this allows them to practice. So while the requirement to make a definitive choice could be read as the action moment here, my goal extends beyond the narrow confines of the assignment. The goal of the assignment is to foster the realization that, to state the obvious, life is hard. Life is filled with difficult choices for which there is no simple solution, and therefore those choices must be deeply considered from a range of viewpoints. This drops students into what Peter Hans Clovenbeck, in describing universities, calls the crucible where the diverse tendencies in human thought are debated and solutions proposed. That's a very ideal view of universities, which I would love to hold to. It doesn't always live up to it, but that's okay. That's what ideals are for. So it is a chance to live in the liminal mess that I described earlier, a place where students must consider problems from various perspectives, even if they do not share those perspectives. So this allows, again, for greater empathy and lessens the tendencies to retreat into entrenched viewpoints. This again speaks to the value of cinema as a generator of empathy. There is, after all, a considerable difference between the perspective we as an audience have of Logan as opposed to the characters that populate the film, including the judge in the case. So the information that we are privy to, we know all along that he is not a murderer, makes our perception of Logan different from those of the characters in the film who only know part of the story. And this is why, after Logan is acquitted, the audience experiences a sense of relief, even as the crowds mock him and the judge calls the jury's decision into question. The lack of opposing evidence allows the characters to stay entrenched in their positions. As the film ends, Keller's public confession forces the characters to reassess their judgments based on evidence that conflicts with their biases. And this sort of clear-cut resolution is a requirement of the Hollywood Production Code. Hitchcock even said he would have rather had Logan die, but that would have meant the killer got off scot-free, which is against the production code. We won't get into all that, but he had to do it. So, and this sort of, as I said, this clear-cut resolution makes for a simpler reckoning than the thought experiment requires. But as I've already mentioned, the answer is never the point. It's always about the thinking. And most importantly, the evaluation and re-evaluation of one's position. Which leads us to our last one. So Ignatian pedagogy aims at foundation, which includes but goes beyond academic mastery. Both the evaluation of the students' perform of this assignment and my evaluation of their work is focused on Arrupe's dictum that the Jesuit education trained persons to be for others. While the realities of university grading and GPA calculations require that I provide them with the students with a grade, and Dr. Bacola and Dr. McLeod would be very upset if I just handed in smiley faces for everyone. I tend towards generosity for students that are obviously engaging with the sort of mental and ethical gymnastics necessary to consider this problem from multiple angles. I am less favorable towards students that fall back on structures and dogmatic rules to avoid getting into the weeds of the question. An answer that declares an unwavering dedication to the priestly vow of silence because of the requirements of canon law is far less interesting to me than an answer that considers the real social reverberations an act of divulging would cause in the community. This approach to evaluation is aimed at fostering the act of thinking deeply about the problem. Rules and a reliance on rules are shortcuts to answers that avoid the process of wrestling with the discomfort of the problem. The goal of the assignment is the evaluation of Logan as a character, the community, the church, religion, and most importantly, the self. So engaging with the messiness of life can be frightening, of course, and is certainly unappealing, hence the often hollow promises of answers proclaimed by many religions, political parties, self-help gurus, and of course, marketing campaigns. Yet, we do a disservice to the students when we attempt to provide simple answers rather than encourage them. As Clovenbach puts it, to honestly face often painful challenges honestly face the often painful challenges of being human with and for others. I'm going to go away from the Catholics for a minute and draw on Marcel Proust because, I'm an English professor and we like to draw on literary figures. Proust wrote, "We are not provided with wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves after a journey through the wilderness which no one else can take for us." The practices of the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm and Proust's insights here work well in conversation. It is one thing to witness a character wrestle through a moral, ethical, and religious morass, and then have a professor explain why such an experience is extremely difficult for the character. But it is something else entirely for a student to place themselves in the situation and find their own way out. The elements of the IPP are useful for thinking about what one must undergo in the journey through the wilderness of complexity this thought experiment requires. The integration of this particular Jesuit educational tradition into this assignment means that when students, after finishing the course, find themselves in the sort of shadowy chiaroscuro environment like Father Logan's sanctuary at night, the work they have done towards becoming persons of conscious competence, compassion, and commitment, what the Secretariat for Education calls the pillars and backgrounds for Jesuit education, might provide them with some wisdom, which Proust states is, quote, "the point of view from which we come at last to regard the world." Thank you. There's Hitch.